So I'd like to begin by asking you to remember the day you turned 6 months old. Of course, this is a ridiculous question because events become memories in parts of the brain that do not fully develop until we're around 4 or 5 years old. And perhaps it's because we can't remember the specific events during early childhood. The popular opinion often assumes that childhood trauma does not have specific long-term effects. But today I want to present the growing body of research that's challenging this perspective. Specifically, my intention is to examine the impacts of trauma on the biopsychosocial development of children. Generally speaking, of course, childhood is a fairly long period extending from birth to adulthood. So in this presentation, I've chosen to focus on trauma occurring during infancy, the first 3 years of life. And I'm doing this because if we can understand the biopsychosocial impacts of trauma in very young children who don't yet have capability for formal memory of events, then we can understand the profound impact of trauma on all children. So let's begin with the brain. Now, I know the typical metaphor for the human brain is a computer, but I think a more nuanced metaphor is of the brain as a train set. Our nervous system transports a range of signals, like trains, to get messages where they need to be. The brain then interprets these messages and sends signals, more trains, with messages about what to do. These neural networks, or train tracks, cause our hearts to pump, lungs to breathe, bodies to move, and everything else needed to adapt and survive in the world. So during the third trimester of pregnancy and then the first 18 months after birth, there's a lot of track work forming in the human brain. And how this track work happens is something that's fascinated many researchers, one of the most influential of these in recent times being Alan Shaw. And he's shown that during the first year, and particularly the first 9 months of life, there's this flurry of activity in the baby's amygdala and the limbic system generally. And these early train tracks, or neural pathways, are the ones needed for regulating the automatic body functions, heart activity, digestion, breathing in response to cues from the external environment. It's used for experiencing positive emotional states and forming social bonds. After this development, at around 9 months old, Shaw suggests that the brain then begins building more direct tracks outward from the limbic system, forming the connections that will eventually allow other areas of the brain to inhibit and regulate the limbic system impulses, something referred to as executive function. Now, during this time, there's also a process called neural pruning happening, and using the train set metaphor, this is a bit like cleaning up the floor in the playroom. Once you've built your train set, the unused parts are tidied up and put away. And this early development makes sense because human survival has, evolutionarily speaking, depended on being able to detect and respond to potential threats and dangers, and at the same time being able to form social bonds. Now, our brains do this by making split-second assessments to identify signs of hostility or danger in other people's body language and facial cues. So our assessment of these cues helps regulate the balance between our fight-flight responses and our social bonding responses. And these social bonding responses in particular underpin our ability to meet our safety, food, shelter and reproductive needs, and it's unlikely humans would have ever survived without this capability. So social bonds are so central to human survival. Why are we not born with these abilities? Well, one common theory you may have heard is that humans are born extremely immaturely compared with other mammals because our brains are so big. And the inference here is that if we were like horses and born at a later stage of maturity, our heads would be too big to fit through the cervix. Now, there may be some truth to that, I don't know, but what I do know is that a train system designed to go through remote snow-covered mountains requires a very different infrastructure to a commuter peak hour train system in a major city. And these spreads of a diversity also apply to the environments that we are born into and must survive in. And it's this so-called immaturity of the train tracks in our brains, of the neural pathways, that allows us to do this. Specifically, the urgent task of the baby during pregnancy and in the first 18 months after birth, therefore, is to build the train set, to put the track work in place. And we need to be in the world to experience our physical and social environment in order to put together the tracks in a way that allows us to survive and function in our own specific conditions. So these survival strategies, building bonds and recognising threats, do not depend on our being able to remember the story or the exact details and sequence of specific events. Rather, they depend on something called procedural memory. In contrast to other more mature types of memory, such as connotative and episodic memories, which tend to be visual and symbolic and representational, procedural memory is instead associated with our patterned and largely subconscious or at least automatic behaviours. So procedural memory begins to form at birth, initially through our affect, and this term affect refers to both the emotional and physiological sensations that we experience in response to our environment. Now, no one needs to teach us affect, it's in our human package. We don't need to be taught how to feel sad or hungry or tired or curious or excited, joyous, mournful, frightened. We don't even need language to experience these affects. But these affects help us do two things. Firstly, they help us learn very, very quickly what the signals in the social environment actually mean in terms of danger or safety by linking these social and environmental cues to the affective responses that they elicit in us. For example, when someone gently and slowly strokes a baby's arm, the C afferent fibres in the skin are activated, sending messages to the brain that elicit a cascade of affects. These are various chemical responses, changes in heart rate and digestive activity, activation of neurological pathways, as well as emotions of pleasure. And in this way, babies learn that gentle touch or perhaps certain facial cues or vocal tones or odours are signals of safety and connection. This type of learning becomes part of our procedural memory, forming the basis of this ability we have to make these split-second assessments about our social and physical environments. This affect, in turn, shapes the development of key parts of our nervous system that are linked to the fight, flight, survival systems, as well as our intimacy and bonding capabilities. And these early experiences also have the capacity to alter genetic expression and activation. The second thing that our early affective experiences help shape is our procedural memories about how to use our own social cues to communicate with others. A baby's intentions, emotions, motivations are visible in their bodies. This, of course, includes the macro movements like posture and limb movement and eye gaze, for example, but human affect is also visible in the baby's micro body language, in the way that they touch, reach, push, pull, yield, vocalise, and even in their heart rate and skin colour and body temperature. And researchers increasingly believe that the way caregivers notice and respond to these cues with their bodies, their voices, their movements, their faces and touch is what helps the infant learn the meaning of their own affect. Now, as Sansone highlights, the baby's world is organised by pre-linguistic communications that interact continuously, unfolding in relation to ongoing actions and other contextual elements. And as Stephen Porges has illustrated, it's these responses to responses to responses, this serve and return interaction that forms the basis of our alarm or our fight-flight responses, and at the same time, our capability to inhibit this response to allow for the formation of social bonds in our specific environments. Now, these understandings about early development help shape the biopsychosocial perspective. And importantly, I think this research challenges some of the more simplified ideas that biopsychosocial perspective is simply about recognising, as Graham Music would suggest, that physiological matters often have psychological and emotional aspects. Because to me, this implies that the psychosocial and biological are still being talked about as distinct and different. And what I believe is that the early infancy research is actually calling for a much more integrated perspective in which we view the biological and psychosocial perhaps as just simply different vantage points from which we're actually viewing the same phenomenon. Now, trauma is a broad term which people use to refer, I guess, from anything like a bad cup of coffee through to a head injury. But complex neurodevelopmental trauma, on the other hand, is quite specific, and it arises out of disruptions to these early relational back and forth processes between the baby and parent. Complex neurodevelopmental trauma is believed to arise in environments where babies are exposed to high levels of fear, but it equally emerges in environments where the baby's affective arousal is not well regulated, or where their own affective responses are met with negative consequences from caregivers. And this highlights that neurodevelopmental trauma is not always a result of overt abuse or neglect, although these are certainly circumstances in which trauma can arise. But although there's this sort of increasing interest in what have been termed ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, as Martin Teacher points out, the event itself is neither the source nor measure of complex neurodevelopmental trauma. Rather, it appears that these events are traumatic or are associated with trauma because they directly impact on the caregiver's capability to provide affectively congruent responses to their baby. To put this in simple terms, trauma seems to arise out of parent-infant interactions that are disrupted to the extent that our procedural memories in the early track work of the baby's brain results in a heightened or reduced sensitivity of the fight-flight bonding systems. And this is so important to understand that trauma is not just about abuse, but that it can be cloaked in so many everyday situations, such as long-term separation, low-quality childcare, or even certain parenting styles. All of these situations have potential to diminish the caregiver's capacity for affectively embodied responses to their baby's cues. Now, Patricia Crittenden has developed the Dynamic Maturational Model, or DMM, to describe long-term behavioural and relational consequences of this early developmental trauma. And according to this model, most healthy relationships are ones in which the baby's fight, flight and social bonding strategies reflect their authentic affective experience in a way that is integrated with cognitive expectations and relatively accurate cognitive expectations about cause-effect relationships. So the DMM suggests that complications arise in a couple of ways. The first of these is when the caregiver responses distort or diminish the infant's affective responses. And this might occur when, for example, a young child expresses sadness or crying, and the caregiver's response communicates that this is not an acceptable emotion. This feedback may be direct, such as shaming and punishing the child, but it can also arise out of indirect responses, such as controlled efforts to ignore or extinguish a baby's sadness, or by constantly distracting them. Because the child depends on the caregiver's relationship for survival at all costs, the early track work and brain development ensures survival by distorting, omitting or denying the sensations which are not acceptable to the caregiver. Crittenden suggests this leads the child to develop survival and bonding strategies that will preference cognitive expectations rather than their own affective experience. And these survival strategies are typically associated with subsequent difficulties of inhibition and compulsion. A second category of survival responses occurs when the child relies on their own affect and has difficulty integrating and predicting the cause-effect information. And an example here might be when the baby receives indiscriminate messages of danger and fear from a parent, which cannot be easily predicted or related to environmental cues. In this case, survival information is informed by the intensity of the child's own feelings, coupled with difficulty in learning cause-effect relationships. And this increasingly leads to complex anxiety-based behaviours. So the behaviours described by Crittenden in the DMM are not merely learned or emotional in some sort of formal sense, but rather they are embedded and remembered in the procedural memory of the body itself. Now, back in 1998, Daniel Stern and colleagues termed this the implicit relational knowing. Almost 3 decades of research since then have described this interplay between the neurostructural and the biochemical memories of early relational trauma as one of toxic stress, which references the long-term impacts of these early relational disruptions. Now, although most researchers agree that neurodevelopmental outcomes are functional responses to early environments, these adaptive responses do not always provide children with the actual capabilities needed to participate in an extended social world. Indeed, it may be that the child's attempts to engage in peer play and social interactions, where the effects of relational trauma first become apparent to others. So Golding and colleagues have offered a checklist of potential behaviours that might be used to indicate the presence of current or previous relational trauma in preschool children. However, I've wondered to what extent these sorts of indicators have the potential to be problematic. For example, Golding's checklist includes extreme clinginess as a potential indicator of trauma. This may be a valid indicator, but clinginess can also be an entirely appropriate behaviour at certain stages of development of the attachment system, or as a response simply to certain stresses. Likewise, other behaviours on the checklist, such as restlessness, inattention and impulsiveness, can be normal, healthy responses in certain contexts. So it seems that extreme care should be taken with descriptive checklists such as these, not to look at the child or their behaviour in isolation, but to also consider the ecosystems and the contexts, and in particular the relationships in which this behaviour is taking place and what adaptive function it might be serving. Because, as some authors have noted, efforts to change children's behaviour which deprive them of their adaptive functional systems may in fact compound any detriment caused by the trauma. Nevertheless, Golding's checklist is consistent with the effective regulation research that we discussed previously, recognising that children's behaviour occurs along a continuum of arousal from extremely subdued to extremely heightened behaviour. Now, I believe that the value of noticing this intensity of arousal is that it does lend itself to highlighting the possible underlying intentions or functions driving this intensity. In other words, it prompts an understanding of children's trauma-related behaviour as having a purpose. Now, Sarah-Lee Chazan extends this perspective by considering the context of play that's often preferred by traumatised children, rather than the behaviour of the child in isolation. Specifically, Chazan proposes a category of what she terms rigid and polarised play, and this is characterised by regimentation and restriction. It lacks the response to response to response, or that serve and return modulation present in authentic human relationships. Perhaps it's unintentional on Chazan's part, but it is nonetheless really interesting to note that this type of play seems to have strong consistency with the DMM perspective on survival strategies involving distortion of affect. And in particular, Chazan notes that rigid and polarised play is characterised by coping with possible threats by either shutting down the affective sense or losing control of impulses. In contrast, Chazan's description of anxious play shares similarities to the cognitively distorted survival strategies of the DMM. And this type of play is often characterised by isolation from other players, a focus on personal sensory experience, observation from a distance, and lack of warmth and joy in the play activity. So we can see here that rather than describing specific behaviours as a checklist, which is a deeply subjective, contextual and culturally informed process, Chazan's framework makes trauma more visible in the child's interactions during play, in the context of the relevant ecosystems and the relationships in their psychosocial activity. So to begin to wrap up this presentation, I want to return to our opening question about remembering life at 6 months old. And what I've argued here is that complex neurodevelopmental trauma experienced in disrupted parent-infant relationships is remembered in the biochemical and neuromuscular structure of the human body, and without healing is subsequently expressed in psychosocial development and our day-to-day social interaction. As children grow and develop, other types of memory, including explicit memory of events, becomes possible. But I have focused on trauma in early infancy here in order to illustrate that children don't need explicit memories to recall trauma. In fact, some authors have suggested that it is the procedural memory of trauma or its implicit relational knowing that causes greater detriment than any explicit memories of specific events, because relational trauma, particularly occurring during early infancy, appears to have a tendency toward more significant and long-term effects than later childhood trauma. So while we are increasingly recognising the importance of play in the child's development, we also need to talk more about the importance of play as a way of understanding what has already happened, what has already taken place. Play is not just important for development, it is also deeply revealing about development. Play not only shapes our learning for the future, it is informed by our past. And viewing human behaviour through the window of children's play and their relationships with others is perhaps one of the most informative ways of understanding and responding to the human and social challenges generated by early childhood trauma. Thank you so much.
I know every creak in the floor between my room and your door. It's the path that I take when I'm suddenly awake. Why I feel the need to creep while my family's sound asleep. I just need one, not them all, so I never call. Oh, the choreography of measuring and stepping lightly. Brush my hand against the wall. I know you listen in your sleep. Though our home is very small, it feels like I am far, far away in the night when I get a fright. Do I dare disturb the still? Throw a rock into a well, holler out to the stage where a cello plays. Hesitating at your doorway, it's the dark end of the hallway. Brush my hand against the wall. I hear you stirring in your sleep, and I'm relieved.